Right. Well, thanks to Ivanka and her colleagues for the invitation, and thanks for this, I say, really excellent initiative in doing some collaborative work between Ulster, particularly TJI, and Queen's. And I look forward to seeing many more such efforts in the future. I'm going to pick up a bit where Bill was just leading off with the somewhat derisory comment about lawyers, if I may. And I'm going to and there's very little that I can add to the theme of multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary research that hasn't already been well canvassed, and I'm sure John will also do a wonderful contribution on that. So I'm going to reflect on law as a discipline and multidisciplinary research. And my starting point in thinking about this is that there's always something a bit embarrassing about saying you're a lawyer and going along to a seminar on multidisciplinary research because for some reason law has not quite shaken off the image of being a profession. It's about training for a particular job and doesn't have perhaps that same tradition, at least in these islands, of being about scholarly engagement, pushing forward the boundaries of knowledge. And this feature of law and legal education, I suppose, also is reflected in why lawyers tend to get terribly embarrassed whenever they're asked about methodology. And there is a stereotypical response that is not actually untrue, unlike many stereotypical responses. What is a lawyer's methodology? Well, I read stuff and then I come to a conclusion. Yeah. And of course, you say that to representatives of other disciplines, and my colleagues are being very polite in their sniggering, I have to say, on this occasion. Yeah? So there's something there about the way law is taught and the conception of law as a profession that I want to come back to at the very end. And really, I was thinking about that. I went to a law school that was a classical black letter law school. Yeah, put a lot of emphasis on technical excellence in the law. And I'm always reminded about that because midway or after midway in my final year of studying law, so having studied law for at this stage nearly 3.5 years, that we had one lecture where one concept was introduced to us for the very, very first time that hadn't really been discussed in depth before. And what was that concept that was being introduced to us as law students for the first time, but the concept of justice? And of course, this is something that was brought to us in our jurisprudence class, and it brought us to engage with, or should have brought us to engage with, in that particular case, other disciplines such as political philosophy. I suppose it highlights for me that law needs to embrace multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary research and multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary education even before you get to research, because it does seem more than just a bit paradoxical that people training to become lawyers only really get introduced to the concept of justice after 3 years of studying a law degree. And law fundamentally needs to benefit from other disciplines because law cannot come up with answers by itself. Lawyers cannot come up with answers to problems by themselves. In fact, lawyers merely using purely legal techniques, whatever those are, and we could have a disagreement as to whether or not there is even such a thing as a purely legal technique, cannot probably identify relevant social problems that law needs to solve. Right? Lawyers using legal techniques can tell you what the law is, but they cannot tell you how this impacts on particular groups in society, be they travelers, be they women, and so forth. And more importantly, cannot tell you what the solutions ought to be. Yeah? Law, purely legal analysis can never tell you what the law ought to be. For that, you need to be able to reflect on resources that come from outside of legal reference points. And so it's important for lawyers to be open to other disciplinary insights. Now, and sometimes that can be extremely productive. I was involved for many years with a collaborative project with an economist, and a project on human rights and budget analysis. and it was useful to be able to feed through solutions that an economist might think of that wouldn't necessarily be obvious or would not be even comprehensible to a lawyer, to actual policymakers. There are some caveats or some warnings, and some of the speakers have already indicated what these are. For me, the biggest one goes back to what I think has to be the first virtue of academic research, which is the virtue of humility. Yeah? We don't know everything, and we can't know everything. And why is this relevant to a discussion on law and multidisciplinarity? It goes back to a comment written by an American judge called Robert Bork. I don't know some of your lawyers. Robert Bork is someone with whom I would probably disagree with on almost every single thing he had ever written, but he did have one footnote in one of his books in which he commented on the feature that at the time there were many legal professors in the United States who were producing wonderful philosophical tracts and then arguing, well, this is what the US Supreme Court should decide. And his point was that this was wonderful, but why aren't they writing these wonderful philosophical tracts for journals like Kampfstudien and other philosophy journals? Yeah? If it really is this high-class philosophical work, it should be appearing in philosophy journals, and it's not. And that is, so as I say, I disagree with almost everything Bork ever wrote, but he's right about this, that we have to be people brought up or educated within a legal discipline to be aware of the challenges of appropriating or making use of insights from other disciplines. We don't know it all. And that is as humble as I can be, speaking as somebody with a law degree. I suppose the other difficulties to remember is, and this applies all throughout, and we've talked a bit about your academic career from being research students through to applying for research grants. And Katie in particular, I think, noted that sometimes being multidisciplinary, Bill also referenced it, can be a bit challenging. Yeah? At the end of the day, if you're writing a PhD and it's a multidisciplinary PhD, we probably won't be putting multidisciplinarians in to examine you, because there may not be very many of them. So if you're doing a wonderful, I'm not picking on anyone in the room, if you're doing a wonderful PhD on law and anthropology, I hope nobody here is doing law and anthropology, it might be a wonderful PhD on law and anthropology, but if your background is law and you haven't had an anthropologist on your supervision team, it might be a high-risk strategy to put you into a viva with an anthropologist. Yeah? So there are some of these practical things, or even other practical things. We often get told when filling out grant applications, be a bit careful saying that your research is multidisciplinary. Yeah? If you say it's multidisciplinary, that means people from two different disciplines may get a chance to shoot down your proposal. And if it is a multidisciplinary proposal, you need to make sure that, as Bill was saying, it needs to be better than almost than you can be, which is, of course, why collaborative research, several of the speakers were saying, is very much the order of the day. You need to bring on board collaborative multidisciplinary teams in order to deliver rigorous multidisciplinary research, it seems to me. A final reflection, I think I started off, well, two final reflections, sorry, if I may. Two final reflections. One, I started off by suggesting that maybe lawyers need to look to other disciplines. The flip side of this is there anything that lawyers, or law students, or legal researchers, with their training can bring to other disciplines? Yeah. If lawyers can look to other disciplines for particular insights, what, if anything, this is a question really for you to think about, what, if anything, can lawyers, can legal researchers bring? Right? What's the value added of having lawyers rather than sociologists and geographers and area studies people on a research team? And I suppose my final point is going back to where I started, the way we structure education in law schools. Increasingly, if all of the major problems in society are necessarily multidisciplinary problems, and if solutions need to be multidisciplinary, then we need to, as educators within law schools, also look to see how we provide an education that equips all law students with that multidisciplinary package, right? So that we're not just training straight lawyers. And that's why it's important that we have people like my former colleague Phil Scraton, who teaches criminology in first year law, why we have at Ulster courses in our first year devoted to law and society, and not just law as taught by the professions. So we have to come back to the beginning of the circle as well and think about how we structure education in university. So thank you.